everybody clear out the room. Next month is July the 10th, and on July 10th, we're going to do something that's quite popular. It's the Hatfield-McCoy feud, complex individuals, complex events. It's featuring our staff member, Randy Mark. So that should be very interesting since that's a pretty hot topic right now. And our July 12th presentation is very exciting as well. How many people's had some problems with the 1940 census? A few of them. But in either case, Mary Glass is going to do a presentation on the 1940 census. And we're looking forward to that. Always check our website out to see what's upcoming. We have some wonderful programs, and tonight is certainly no different. We have a great presenter tonight. Gilbert Casto will present History of the Kanawha Valley and Fort Lee. And that, I think, would be some nice early history. He's brought some artifacts that are on the table, which he will probably point out as he goes along. And it's important to know that Gilbert Casto is a native West Virginian. Casto's family has lived in the area since 1800. He is a graduate of West Virginia State University and is retired from Republic Container Company of Nitro. And I think this is very interesting. His hobbies include providing interpretation of the 18th century Kanawha Valley to school and other groups and giving demonstrations at Fort Randolph and Fort Pleasant. Casto is a member of the board of the Fort Randolph Committee and is a member of the Sons of the American Revolution, the Sons of the Confederacy, and the American Long Rifle Association. There's probably a long rifle over there. I would like to say one more thing before introducing Mr. Casto. You can tell that some of our presenters, and most of them, have a love for what they do and a passion for it. They live it, they reenact it, they search for history. And I would have to say that the passion is there. Let's hear it for Gilbert Casto.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. I was okay until I saw that road. That road, I'm done. And I appreciate all of you coming out, and especially supporting the library. They have a fine staff and a lot of good information. They've helped me out a great deal. We're trying to get Jamie down to the fort. Sometimes she's in the Indian, she just doesn't know which way she wants to go. But we're working on that. What I would like to do, and I need to make some clarifications, that one, I'm not a historian. I'm not a professor. I'm just a guy that likes this. I grew up in the country. Some of this stuff I grew up with. Some of it I didn't. I've heard a lot from my grandfathers and all. And I started in this hobby, and that's what this is reenacting hobby. In 1976. And I've seen it come a long way. Most of the people started in this hobby at that time were buckskinners, mountain. That's all we knew. And as the years progressed, we evolved into frontiersmen of this time period. My time period that I'm most interested in is from 1755 to 1788. And that pretty well covers the French and Indian War, Pontiac's War, Dunmore's War, and the Revolution in this area. Now, what happened back east, I can't tell you. I know we won. But, so I want to get started, and the first thing I want to do is make some clarifications on history. As my uncle would say, history is made up of two words: his story. So whoever book you're reading, whatever paper, whatever lecture you're reading, it's his story. So here's my story. The books that I have researched to try to get some, and there's not a whole lot of the history of this valley up until after Kanawha, Charleston was built, and all. So if I'm vague on some, I apologize. And I hope that you will go back and do research your own. In the last 20 years, there has been so many myths about history debunked because of the reenactors. They have went and researched and found documentations. Doing this, I want to read real quick some of the books that I've researched for this. The book for Fort Duquesne and Fort Pitt, Hardesty's Historical and Geographical Encyclopedia of '83. Dale Payne, who was a state policeman and a magistrate in Fayette County, has wrote a series of 8 books based upon the Draper and Shane interviews of this area and surrounding. A Guide to Civilian Clothing, Captain Matthew Arbuckle's biography, The Great Kanawha Valley, A Hail, the Ohio Company of Virginia, which is very important to this area, Meyer's History of West Virginia, Volume 1 and 2, Marking Our Past, West Virginia Historical Markers, Annuals of Fort Lee, Frontier Forts in West Virginia. And I have some of the books here. And what I hope to do is, after we talk a while, and I'd like for you to come up, you look at everything, handle it. I will explain anything you want. All what you see on this table, other than the books, is stuff I use. When I go in the woods, I carry a lot of this. So there's nothing fake up here. It might be a reproduction of an original, but it's real, and I use it. So the knives are sharp, the gun shoots, and the hawk cuts. So I just wanted to get that out of the way. The main thing I want you to understand starting out with, history has changed. A lot of the stuff I grew up in school, and maybe you, was all handed down by the ancestors and taken for granted it was real. Example, Betsy Ross's flag. Everybody knows Betsy Ross made the circle flag. She didn't do it. That was, from what I can gather, and like I say, this is all my interpretation. If you disagree, that's fine. And I'll go into that in a minute. Her ancestors came up with that story around 1880s. There is a group, I think in Boston, that has a complete history of her and all about it and about the flag. The flag itself was authorized in 1777 with 13 stripes and all that, and the 13 in a circle in the wood. Okay. Another thing I'd like to do, I want to try to enlighten you, make you do research, but I hope you will talk to me, ask questions, and maybe I'll learn some more stuff that I can do more research. So instead of me standing here and lecturing you probably about stuff you already know, I'd like to go through a list. Some of it will be back and forth like a tree on limbs, but I'd like for you to ask questions while I'm doing this. If you don't understand something, ask. If you know something more than I do, because I know everyone here is here for a reason, that's to learn. So let's all learn together. And like I said, I don't know everything. So let's start. Oh, and another thing, a lot of these books that I read you will contradict each other. Hardesty's encyclopedia will contradict something Hale said. Hale will contradict. So, depending on which book you read, will be which story you hear. So, if you disagree with me, that's great. This is just what I've found. Most of the history in the last 20 years have been based upon Draper's and Shane interviews, from what I can gather. Doddridge's book, he lived through the time, but he wrote it later. And a lot of Shane and Draper's interviews were 50 years later than what actually happened. So I know some of you might know, as older you get, you don't remember everything that actually happened, and a lot of times you won't make yourself look better. So you need to really document what you think, because handing down history, and as long as I've been in it, I've heard some wild stories. Everyone, and this is no reflection on them, everyone in Mingo, Logan County, their grandmother was a Prince Cherokee. And I've been there and I've heard it all. So that's what I want to make sure you understand. Because you read it in a book, it might not be so. So take everything with skepticism. Some of the new things that they're coming out with now that are getting a lot of history is the runaway ads. You can find a lot of ads in the Virginia Gazette of the time, Pennsylvania Gazette, and some of the others. It will describe clothing, what they took, what they did, in a lot of cases what they wore, and what they ate. So that's a good reference point. And I will say this before I get into it, the rest of it. In all the time I've been doing demos and talking to especially kids or adults, there's always somebody in the crowd that's ready to prove you wrong. So that's what I state right up front. I know nothing. So here we go. And any questions you have, please ask. As most of you know, the Kanawha, or the Kanawha, is made up of several creeks and rivers. Indians roamed here for thousands of years. Some records show that most of the big villages were abandoned in the late 1600s. And the smaller ones continued up until the 1750s later, when the migration of the white man came home. When the white people started to venture into these mountains, the remaining Indians slowly started to move across the Ohio due to treaties and the influx of the white. This valley was late in being settled due to the location and Indian hostilities. Now I would like to show you so you can get an idea. In the 1750s, This right here is what they call the Shenandoah Valley, I believe, all the way from Maryland down to Tennessee. This comes into the Powell Valley, Martin Station, and such. That was considered at this time, the 1740s and 1750s, as the backcountry. That was the farthest that they had settled because of one of the mountains, because of the Indians, and because of the trees that they made with the Indians. And that is an interesting thing to read about, as Doug can tell you here, all the different treaties and what that meant to the Indians. And each treaty they moved the boundary. So finally, the last treaty, this would be the Ohio. Everything on the south side of the Ohio belonged to Virginia. And that included over in here to Kentucky, all the way to Mississippi. Now, in the 1750s, on the on the west side of the Mississippi was French. To the north, in Canada, was French. To the south was Spanish. And they all wanted this land, and so did England coming west. That's one of the reasons for the French and Indian War. Lord Dinwiddie sent Washington up here to the points. They were building forts coming down from Canada to prevent the English from moving across. And, you know, you read about Washington, necessity, and all that. The key points to get into, we remember that the New River goes all the way into the Carolina. It flows north. At one time, this whole river was called Woods River, New River, then the Kanawha. You had the Gully coming in, and you had Elk River coming in. And then you had Poker River, and on the other side, you had the Cold River. So as you can see, all this is mountains through here, which the main interest in getting over to here was through the north, through Fort Pitt, coming down around to the Cumberland Gap. We all know about Boone and the Cumberland Gap. Thomas Walker finding the gap, naming it the Lower Cumberland, and coming into Kentucky. So you can see how isolated this valley is. Until you get down here to the Kanawha and the Ohio, there wasn't much in here. Okay, some of the people that I have found, and Doug, you know this, so correct me because I don't have all the dates. Oh, you know you're the top dog. Okay, the first record of anyone other than the Indians that I find was a captain named Saline. Was that in the 40s or the 50s? Wasn't around the late 40s? Or?
I think the last time I tried to piece it together, it was actually after Mary.
It was after. Okay.
1761 or something like that.
Okay. So we had Saline. Records show that Matthew Arbuckle made several trips down the Kanawha Valley from the Greenbrier in our area to trade. There was supposed to be a trading post on the Ohio ran by the French. That's all I know about that. And in his biography, it said he made several trips. Christopher Gist, Washington's companion, when he went to tell the French to leave and save Washington's life, In 1750, I found a record that he visited the lower end. Mary Ingalls, of course, we all know, in 55. Simon Kent was here on the Elk in 71, 73, in those time periods. Mr. Kelly had a cabin at Kelly's Creek at Cedar Grove. In around 73, the Indians attacked. He sent them away right before, and he was killed. Morse at Cedar Grove, he had a fort, and they called it the boat yard. And at one time, this was in I'm not sure on the date of that, but it was somewhere in this time period, 73, 70. But he didn't have the boat yard. The boat yard was later. Lewis's army led approximately 1,200 men down through this area in 74. Matthew Arbuckle was their guide because he knew the area. 1743, a party consisting of John Howard, John Peter Salling, and others traveled by boat down the Greenbrier, New River, Kanawha, Ohio to Mississippi in 43, where they were captured by the French. In 49, I found a listing of Dr. Thomas Walker came to Kentucky through the southern route and returned possibly up the Kanawha Valley to the Greenbrier region, noting the Greenbrier settlement. Now, this is something in 55, which leads, all this leads up to the Kanawha Valley. In 55, we're coming in here to the Greenbrier Flats settling early, even as early in the 40s, and the Taggart Valley. Now, in 55, Cornstalk came up the Little Kanawha and attacked the people in these settlements and killed many of them, which forced them back. And all this was leading up before. So the settlements were here. This was about as far as they came in West Virginia, was the Greenbrier Valley. Now, they knew the Kanawha River, so they needed to get from here down to here. And it's approximately 160, 180 miles across country. Now, I find in the books that a lot of enters started in the 1770s. And we come back up, let's see, let me just read this, then I'll get into explain that. In my research, I found that the main enters of the valley started in 1770. This was due to the treaties that opened up the land to the Ohio and to the Ohio Land Company, which received a grant of 200,000 acres that encompassed this area, down the Ohio and up the Kanawha. And this was from. So here's where I want to start doing a little talk about 1755 and the French and Indian War, and why it was important to the Kanawha Valley. After the French and Indian War, the English government had no way of paying the soldiers for their services. After much finagling with the Crown, by the upper societies, Washington, probably Franklin, and many, maybe even Dinwiddie, I'm not sure on that. It was finally decided that land grants west of the Blue Ridge would be given as payment. After the taking of Fort Duquesne, which was changed to Fort Pitt in 58, this opened up the northern route to the Ohio. Traders were using this before, but not as much. The north side and south side of the Ohio were they would go down. even as far, okay, this was something I had a lot of hard time trying to get through my thick skull. Morton and Barton, Morton and Barton, I'm not sure on how to pronounce it last name, had a trading post at Casky. And they were sending in the 50s up and down the Ohio River over doing trade. So that probably had a bigger effect after Fort Pitt was given, the English took over. I think in researching, you will find and draw maybe the same conclusion that the fight for pay was not so much for the soldier as it was for the wealthy men that fought for them. I feel they knew most of the people would not risk crossing the mountains in hostile territory to make settlements. They would sell their patents cheap, and doing a lot of, I'm sure if you look at Washington and all his grants, you'll see a lot of this was where his agents would buy the patents up of the soldiers, and that's how come he kicked so much land. And some of the Ohio Company were Lord Dunmore, George Washington, and Ben Franklin. The Ohio Company, like I said, received 200,000 acres. And there's a book that it really explains it good on that. The Ohio Company of Virginia and the Western Movement. It sort of played out, but during this time period, it was a very important part of the selling over the mountains. So we know that Washington came to the point, and the point is Point Pleasant, but at the time it was referred to as the Point, in 1770 with Christopher Gist, which again was his friend and agent, land agent. Supposedly, Washington came up the Kanawha about 16 miles to view the land. Washington, along with other members of the Ohio Land Company, had the great scheme to make this into the 14th colony of Vandalia. Washington, I feel, had found a piece of land on the south side of the Kanawha, about a mile up from the mouth of the Ohio and the Kanawha, and he wanted to make this capital of the 14th colony. In 1755, he sent in a group of men to clear 20 acres of land in this patent. They built 10 log cabins, 3 log homes, and they separated the cabin from the home, so the cabins must have been bigger. The homes. A log barn, planted corn, potatoes, turnips, and 2,000 peach stones. In 75, later that, in the spring, there was an Indian uprising. At the same time that they came in, Fort Blair was still at the point, which I will get into Fort Blair in a minute. So when these workmen decided to go back east, they had to prove that Washington had worked on his claim. In these patents, you would buy them for any amount, maybe 10 shillings, 10 pounds, depending upon the amount of land. You had 1 year to work on your land. You had to have a shelter, you had to clear land, and you had to plant crops. If you did not, you would lose your patent and the money you paid. So it was very important. These men went over to Fort Blair. they got Captain Russell, who was the commander of Fort Blair, and he wrote a certification that Washington land was taken care of according to the pact. They left. So far, I have found in 70 to 73 to 74, this is what I have found of Washington's land in the valley. And I'm sure there's more, but this is all I found so far. He had 2,950 acres at the mouth of Tyler Creek and embraced Dunbar. 2,000 acres in 74 by Floyd, which covered St. Albans from the Cold River to about Jefferson. 10,990 acres on the south side of Kanawha, and that's what I was talking about. In 73, he had 21,941 acres Pocatello survey. In 73, he had 7,276 acres at Red House. And what the one book I saw was that his brother Lawrence lived there and was passed down into the families.
Did each piece of land have a home to be approved, each section?
Yeah, what the plan was, they would buy all these large patents, then they would sell them out, and they'd get a quick rent off of it. And then if they didn't pay, if they didn't do the work that was supposed to be on it, they would take back the land. Now, when I'll get into a little bit, I don't want to get into too much, about surveying on the frontier. And this had a great problem. Now, okay, so, which brings me up to 1774, which I think was the biggest thing that happened to this valley, and what brought people in eventually. It didn't happen then, but it brought them in. When Andrew Lewis, under Dunmore's War, was to bring his troops down the valley to the point to where he was to meet with Dunmore's War. Because of Arbuckle, they came across, and I will read it in a minute, and they came down through Cedar Grove and down through there. And anyone that has went up there, they know how the hills come together. It's a nice place, but it's not a farming place. Once they turned around the upper end of Bell and started down through this valley and see how it opened up, and all the bottoms and the timber, and the men said, this is ideal farming. I think that started them to think about wanting to move into this area. Now, supposedly there was a cabin. They saw an old cabin at Campbell's Creek at this time. And one book says that's where the name Cabin Creek came from. They found a cabin in 74. Again, I don't know. This is what one book says. And the one key thing on the frontier that if you do any reading where it's about Boone, where it's about Boonesboro, any of it, the most important thing other than food on the frontier was salt. And they had the salt. They knew the salt because Mary Ingalls did the salt work. You know, they stopped there. Now, one interesting thing on this march, Dr. Fleming was one of his commanders under him, and Fleming kept a journal. And if you read Dunmore's War by White, Kellogg and White, whatever how you want to pronounce it, Lewis wrote an article. There's been several. They stopped at Burning Springs. Has anyone been to Burning Springs at Bell? Have you actually been to it?
I used to live up there, and people used to tell me where it was, but you can't tell if that's where it was.
Well, I went up one day. My curiosity got the best of me. So you drive up this road, this hollow, and then you're supposed to go up this hollow, the first big hollow, somewhere up there. No markers or nothing like that, other than down to the road, says Burning Springs. Nobody knows where it's at. So my question, how did they know it was there? I found one reference, and I think in one of the books, I found that a Van Bibber, which they was talking about coming here, doing a relative of Van Bibber is coming here. He had been at the spring where the salt lake, the gas, whatever you mean, Burning Springs. I'm thinking maybe he told them about it and they wanted to see it. But unless they knew about it, there's no way they would have ever found it. It's caused one hill over. So I thought that was interesting. They marched to the elk and supposedly went up to it maybe a mile or so to be able to cross the elk, where they made camp and they started building canoes to carry a lot of their rations downriver. Lewis's army estimate 1,200 men. They had, I think they started out with like 300 cows and all this equipment for the army brought in with horses. They left a lot of the horses and they took the canoes down to the point. Several men, by the time they came here, had come down with smallpox. So they left several here at Elk to heal. And then one of the Christians was to bring the beeves and the rest of the men after they left the next day. They followed out the next day. And of course, as you know, the further they marched, the wider the valleys became. Now, I live at Poca, and one of the things I found most interesting in Fleming's journal, they came to a river. It had high banks, 3 to 4 foot deep, and about 30 to 40 yards wide. And it was very muddy. And they called it the Poca. One place it says the Poca Talco, I find it says the Poca. So there again, you're looking at whatever author you want to call it. And I find it interesting because other than being a little bit deeper, it's still muddy. It's never changed. Okay. And and you'll have to forgive me, I'm hooked up on Lewis's March because there's so many interesting things, but it all pertains to this valley. Another interesting point was mentioned in Fleming's journal. About 16 miles above the point, they found a part of a plowshare, a human jawbone, and a piece of blue shirt. Some of the men recognized it as belonging to a brother to a Mr. Hall who has a patent in that area. And supposedly he was down there working on his brother's claim. How he died, was he killed the Indians, was he killed wild beast, no one knows. But they recognized him because of a blue shirt. Now, in our hobby, everybody has to wear brown or it's not correct. I know, Gracie. Why do you think I dyed it blue for? But anyway, so this is in 74, so they were already starting. They made it to point, I'm not going into the battle, but after the battle, there were several wounded. They had to bury the dead, so they built a small fort. And this was Fort Blair. It was built at the point. It was very small. It held them in until they could get well. The Fort Blair lasted until 75 when the Indian uprising, and they were called back. The fort was burnt. I have no documentation of this. I think that's what happened to Washington's cabins when they left. If you go down the south side of the Kanawha, above Henderson, about 9 miles, you'll see the sign, the Lost Colony. And that's where Washington, I think, had these men built the cabins and stuff. And of course, after 75, during 76, the revolution started. Washington and them had other things to worry about than the 14th colony. The second fort at the point was built in 76, and it was called Fort Randolph, and was abandoned in 79, and it was burned again by the Indians. Then in 80, and you got to remember, okay, you've got these forts, all these people are coming into the forts, some for protection, so that's bringing people into the battle. Then in 80, they came back and built a third fort, and it was also called Fort Randolph. This fort lasted until 94 and was abandoned basically after the Battle of Fallen Timbers, when the Indians finally gave up the hostilities and the wars basically were over. It should be noted that Daniel Boone came to the point around 88. If you've done research on Boone, you know he did the Cumberland Gap, you know he was down in the Carolinas and Kentucky, and he died in Missouri. Nobody knows about 10 years he was into this battle. He traded, he had trapped, he hunted, he had a trading post at the mouth of Crooked Creek down into Point Pleasant. Later he would move up here to Kanawha City and build another trading post. One book said he was the first to catch a beaver on the upper Kanawha. If all these people were in here before, if Kenton and all them, that's another example of his story. In 91, he became a representative of the Kanawha and walked to Richmond. I think that was where it was at then, with Mr. Clendenin. Mr. Clendenin rode a horse and Boone walked. The next fort I want a brief talk on is Fort Lee. It was called Fort Lee, the official title. The unofficial title, it was called Clendenin's Fort or Clendenin Station. This fort was built on the east side of the Elk and Kanawha Junction. The property belonged to a Mr. Thomas Bullock, who did surveying in this area in the 70s for Washington, along with John Floyd. Thomas Bullock died in 78, and the property was left to his brother Cuthbert Bullock. He was granted this patent in 79 and signed by Thomas Jefferson. This was a patent granted to Mr. Bullock for his military service in the French and Indian War.
There existing copy of the patent.
I am sure, and I don't know what this library has, since, Jamie can probably help you, or Mr. Taylor. I know they have maps and old patents and stuff, but I honestly don't know what all they can. Yes?
Mr. Bullock's very right from the party.
I don't know that.
There's Thomas Bullock over there.
Okay. I don't know if that's the same one, because he was buried, he died in 79, or 78. Yeah, so it could be an ancestor. Of course, back then, every generation had a Tom, Dick, or Harry. And so it's hard to keep up with, but it could be, I don't know. In 87, there was a report that there was 60 families settled on both sides of the Kanawha beyond the Gulf, and the families needed protection. Since Fort Donnelly and Fort Savannah were at the Greenbrier, this was too far away. Fort Randolph, too, was too far away. Therefore, it was considered, George Clendenin of Greenbrier was at Richmond and bought 1,040 acres off of Cuthbert for 5 shillings. In 88, they came, his brother, at one place I read it was his son, William Clendenin. They came, was to the point to build, well, not the point, but the forts here. They decided they were supposed to go on somewhere else. I think they were supposed to go at Cedar Grove or somewhere, but they came down here, decided this was the best place, because it was his land, I guess, that they would build a fort here. So in 88, the fort was built and named for Lee. It cost 110 pounds, 22 shillings, and 3 pence. There were many clashes between the Indians and whites in the area, but to my understanding, again, the fort was never attacked. It did run low at one time on powder in 89, and this is where the famous Madame Bailey made a ride to Greenbrier to get more powder. And she was given the horse London, and she, from then on, she ran from here to the point to Greenbrier, doing taking messages and whatever else. So you can read about her and all her. Now, another fort that was built, and this was confusing, so I don't have a whole lot of information on the packet at Cold River. It was, one book said it was built before 1788 because supposedly it was burnt by the Indians on January the 5th of 1788. Hale has a chapter, a small block on it. If you know these books, you can do more research. The Great Kanawha Valley by Hale. This one, thanks to my good wife, Daniels of Fort Lee, tells the story of Fort Lee. They have a copy here, if I'm not mistaken. They probably have a copy of all these books. I found this one very interesting. This was published by the Culture Center, I believe, by McBride. Frontier Forts in West Virginia. It gives you some good information there. I found these set, a volume, Myers History of West Virginia. Gives a lot about the forts in the area. And you have to understand what a fort is. A fort can be a station, it can be a blockhouse sitting in the middle of the field. So it can, these forts, Point Pleasant, Fort Lee, were military that were authorized. The others, they would build a blockhouse, which is one cabin floor with an upstairs that hangs open, so they could shoot down and protect from Indians climbing the walls. It could be stockaded, a fence around it, or it might not be. The first wagon road was called Koontz, K-O-N-T-Z. It was opened from Lewisburg to the Kanawha River. And this route was taken, from what I can gather, basically on what Lewis's march was. The route was by Muddy Creek, Kenny's Knob, Rich Creek, Gully River, 20 Mile, Dill's Creek, Campbell's Creek, to Kelly's Creek, to Hughes Creek, to the Kanawha River. Now, I have no idea, I'm lost on that. That's back across the mountains. But, huh?
Name of the route?
Koontz, K-O-O-N-T-Z. I gotta tell you a funny story about this. Never heard the name Koontz. Didn't know anything about it. When I was in service, way back, I was overseas in Japan, and my commander was Koontz. My mother had sent me a West Virginia flag, and I had it flying in my office. Come to find out, Koontz was from Gully Bridge. So every time he would come in, his son would come into my office, grab the West Virginia flag, and start flying in front of him. It might have kept me out of trouble, so I'm not sure. But it's funny how names will show up. Now, okay, I've talked. I'm sort of at a standstill on this. I believe this is as far as I can go on the general study of the valley. I hope you will do the research and dig into more on the history. In doing so, I hope you won't get confused by finding contradiction from one book to another. And I've given you examples on this. So I'd like to, if anybody has any questions now, or I would like to talk briefly, I don't want to hold you up, on frontier equipment and surveying of the valley. Does anyone have any questions right now?
Have you heard, I have a reference to supposedly a fort called Frozen Camp. Do you have any idea where that might be?
Well, I know Frozen Camp is out by Ripley, on the other side of Ripley. But I can't tell you that. Let me look in the book. Now, this has been researched.
I don't think you're gonna find it in there, I think it's Civil War era.
This is Civil War era.
I think it was a camp
Now, this is what I'm looking for,
there. Go ahead and look.
is pre-Civil War. He was dead 30 years before the Civil War.
I do not see it, ma'am.
I have reference to someone who was born at Frozen Camp, and this would have been about 1790s. But I have no idea what Frozen Camp is.
I honestly,
Okay.
you just have to keep looking. Let me check one thing.
I keep asking everyone I know.
But the Frozen Camp I know, is about 15, 20 miles out of Ripley going towards Glenwood, outer road. Now, I won't,
Might have been really
that's the only frozen camp I know, so.
He was supposed to be military. And she gave birth, it was more frozen. That's all that I have in mind.
it was out there at the time,
Since Fort Lee, this is Al Myers' history. I'm going to read this real quick. Fort Lee, this fort named in honor of Governor Lee of Virginia, was situated on the site of the present city of Charleston. Now, supposedly Charleston is named for Charles Clendon, the capital of the state. It was erected in the summer of '88 by half of a company of rangers from Greenbrier County sent to protect the inhabitants of the Great Kanawha Valley from the incursions of Indians. George Clendon was county lieutenant of Greenbrier County at the time and was directed the work of construction. Writing Governor Edwin Randolph under date of June 9, '88 said, "We built a very strong fort and finding it impossible to keep the place with the few men that were in service, I thought it was expedient to order the remainder of the Ranger Company into service. Within the next 7 years, much interesting frontier history was made there. June 11th, 93, Colonel John Steele, United States Inspector of Western Defenses, inspected Captain Hughes Caperton's company of Greenbrier Rangers stationed at the fort." So, bear with me just a minute. I'm going to see if I can. No, I don't.
What are the expenses of building the fort? Who bore the expenses of that as well?
Well,
Or the area?
There was a descendant of Clendon who was telling me of the documentation, and I think she left. Josh, you had something?
On the expenses, I think it depended on who the fort belonged to, because if private individuals own forts, like Joseph Doddridge, who wrote the book, his father owned the fort, and his father built and maintained the fort, and I believe he had some sort of trading post or blacksmith shop or something there, so I think it just depends on if it was a county, like did the people in the neighborhood get together and build one, was it something that the fledgling government funded?
I believe that Fort Lee, because it was authorized by the governor and named for the governor, Clendon submitted expenses for the fort to the governor of Virginia. Now, according to the lady, they never paid it. So I don't know. Okay, is there any other questions?
Oh, Gilbert on Fort Tackett. I did a lot of looking there many
Okay.
years ago, and the best I've been able to find, the supposed location of Fort Tackett was down at the old Valley Drive-In Theater, back in the back corner where the fishing lakes were.
Okay. Now supposedly when it was, they escaped, when the Indians attacked, there were some out of the fort. They were killed. Some were able to escape. A man and woman and a child, the first child born in the area, came to Fort Lee. There was supposed to be one daughter of maybe Tackett was escaped. She came, Boone took her in. She married a Boone. So, you know, the stories just go on and on, and I can't say what's true or not.
You know, mentioned, Keziah Tackett was interviewed. She was an old woman by a journalist for a paper in Cincinnati. You can actually find that transcription of that interview online. It's also in Bill Dean's book about St. Albans history, about coal and timber drains. I think those are all in the title of this book. Really good book, by the way. So he reprinted Isaiah Tackett's interview, actually. He printed the pages from the paper in the book there. I mean, she gives some interesting information about the history of Fort Tackett and what happened when it was attacked. That's probably the closest thing we have to source, except for a few little mentions in military records over there.
Now, St. Albans has a historical society. It was, I don't know if it's changed, it was in the old train station.
Yeah,
Next
Bill
door.
Dean was was the principal agent in the historical society.
And I wanted to get there before I came to see if they had anything. I missed him at History Day, that I didn't get over there. I was tied up here at the Capitol. So there is a good place, if you're interested in Tackett's Fort, that you might find more information. Yes,
That building, it's next door to the old depot. And
okay,
it will be open the first Saturday of every month, July, August, and September, from 11 till 2. So if anybody
Okay.
wants to come down, 11 to 2, first Saturday of the month.
okay, that's great. I appreciate that because they have a lot of good books. I was able to see some of them up here one time at History Day.
I'd also like to add that Stephen Tays, from the Tays family, recorded a lot of history, and he also verifies the fact that there was, the Tacketts did escape, and eventually one of the Tacketts was a sheriff or something at the fort. He had held a military post, and there is family down on Tackett's Creek that can trace their history back to the Tacketts and Youngs.
I found in all the books, there's just a little blurbs about Tackett's Fort.
Yeah.
And I really couldn't give you much more information. The one interesting story, and maybe if I have it wrong, because this was passed down to me through many years, Tackett was captured before the burning of the fort. Indians, or was it after? It wasn't. It was before the fort burning.
I can't remember either, yeah.
Okay, but anyway, he was captured. He was taken by the Indians down towards the point. They were on the hill, and he was tied up to a tree while they went off hunting. And while they were gone, a terrific rainstorm came. And it loosened up the ties on his wrist where he was tied to the tree, and he was able to escape. Now, my grandfather always said, when we went down there, he said, now, up there's Tackett's tree. But, you know, I've read this in the history books. I'm sure it's true. You don't know. Okay.
Hale said it fell down. J.P. Hale said it's gone. The original is gone. You can still get up there, by the way. It's still a wooded hillside, and there are several pine trees up there, but none of them are old enough to be the one that Lewis Tackett's died.
It's like where I live, the story of Pocatello, the Indian that died, jumped off the cliff. They chased him. One story was he was at the Battle of Point Pleasant, and he survived, and Rangers, some of the men chased him all the way to the point, and he jumped at Poca. He jumped off the hill, broke his leg, swam across, and they finished him off and buried him under a pine tree. Then there's one story about him chasing Mad Ann Bailey, and the men were cutting trees. So there's all kinds of stories in the valley. Research. Make sure, and when you finally get what you think is right, be able to change your view. Because something is so different. This is a compass with a sundial. This is a rough translation from one that was found on Robert Rogers' album of Rangers, Rogers Rangers, in the French and Indian War. So That's one. I was talking to some gentlemen down to Martin Station Siege a couple weeks ago, and I was talking to them about what I tried to do as a frontier surveyor to learn what I need to do better. I am not a surveyor. My grandfather is, and a lot of this stuff came from him. When Bullitt, Floyd, and all them were doing the surveying of the frontier, they had basically a Jacob staff, a transit compass, a Gunther chain. This is a half chain, 33.5 feet. They would measure the land. They would have about 20 members to the surveying party. They would have a camp follower who would take care of the camp. They would have pen men, hunters, guards protecting them, and a flag man. And they would start out, and I think you can even find them here, the patents that shows you start at a tree on the north side of the bank, 3 forks, you go east 33.5 chains, half chain, which this would be this, go left, south, whatever, and you still find the deeds listed. Now, I always had a question when you came to a hill, and we know we got some hills here. How would you do it? And I've heard a lot of different ways, and they explained to me this type of survey. There was 2 types of survey. There was this type, and I'm probably going to get this name wrong, geographic survey, and that was more of a military type, where they used longitude, latitude. This type of surveying is strictly a chain and compass. And that's how the majority, most of the surveys that were done in this valley were done. You had to be a certified surveyor. You either had to be trained under a surveyor who was certified, and he would certify you, or you had to go to a school. The school here was William and Mary in Virginia. I have 2 reference books. One is The Practical Surveyor. This is a copy of a 1725 surveyor's book. The other book is called GeoAsia. A gentleman came from England, and he went down in the Carolinas, and he watched them survey, and decided they didn't know what they were doing. So he went back to England and wrote a book. And this copy, it was first published in 1663. And this is a copy of the 8th edition, published in 1768. And I'm going to be honest with you, I could never be a surveyor. I can't understand it. Of what? Oh yeah. Now I found out too, if you're pointing at a direction, and I don't know how this would happen, but if you would point your compass at, say, northeast, and you came to a tree, and that tree at this time was a little bit more than a cutter could do, they would come to a point, put the Jacob staff at that point. They would chain the measurement over to the side, mark the number of links, set the Jacob staff, go to past the tree, and then come back over, then continue on, if they couldn't cut the path. It was hard work, and it was dangerous work. If we know the whites coming across were taking the Indian lands, which caused a lot of the trouble and all the wars and everything, most of it. when the British wasn't involved. If an Indian would find a man with a compass, he was pretty much dead. There were a lot of surveyors that never came back. Now, the surveyor would write his pattern, the diagram in his journal, and then take it back, and it would be recorded at the county seat of that county. And they did we all know the Mason-Dixon line, and it was done this way, from what I understand. They recently, in the last 10 or 15, 20 years, did a GPS reading of it. And where they stopped, because the Indians would go no further as their guides, they stopped with the GPS, and the lines were like 30 yards off. So it was amazing how accurate it actually was from that time to, compared to the GPS.
Well, Mason and Dixon are also correcting their chain and compass survey with sightings on stars.
Right. Okay, any questions on survey? Okay, militia, frontiersmen. The militia was from age, depending on what colony they were from, because each colony had their own rules, 15 to 60. It was mandatory that you were in the militia. Now, a lot of people headed to the woods, didn't want to do it and all that, and there were severe penalties if you didn't. Basically, a militiaman was required to have a serviceable firelock, a powder horn, a shot bag, or a pouch to carry anywhere from 30 to 60 rounds. Either a bayonet, if it was a smoothbore, a knife, or an axe. Now, most people think that the majority of the people that come to the frontier carry tomahawks like the Indians. And most of them would carry a pole axe. It was more useful because you could hammer it. You could do a lot more. They carried this is an example of an Indian trade scalpel. A lot of them had the red handles. It was this upsweep blade, thin, and this was shipped over from England, France, Denmark, a lot of places in barrels to trade to the Indians. And this was the typical knife that I feel frontiersmen would carry, talking to a lot. They would also have to have a powder horn to carry the powder. One of the first things at a military installation they would do, if they were carrying kegs of powder, would be build a magazine. A magazine is just basically a root cellar to keep the powder in, so it would not spark or static electricity would explode. They would have a bullet mold to fit the gun. They might carry, and depending on what it is, and again, depending if it was military, if it was an individual hunter, they would have a small brass kettle to cook in. They might have a noggin, which is made out of a barrel of a tree, or a horn cup. The majority of the people did not carry canteens. You see more of that back east, because the water was clean. You come to a stream, you could dip up and drink on the water. A lot of people would just carry a simple tin cup. You could cook in this, drink, whatever. One of the key things you had was an awl, because after a while, the hard shoes, the modern shoes that they wore would wear out, end up in moccasins. Moccasins don't last. You have to repair them daily, just about. This is a key element. They will probably have more than one. Is a fire kit, flint and steel, to build fire. Everyone, I can build it with a gun if I had to. It's a lot easier with this and a lot safer. Trade beads, this is wampum. I found an interesting story about Doug, help me out. What was Patton's first name? James Patton, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, James Patton was a big big guy back east. He happened to be at Draper's Meadows when Mary Ingalls was captured. Supposedly, they opened the cabin door. He was at a table. He had his broadsword. He was Scottish. He fought the Indians, but he died. But anyway, he was sent north for a treaty to get the Indians to come to the treaty. He carried about 4,000 or so of these trade beads. This is wampum. At the time, they were made out of shell. They were like money to the Indians. They were very important. The designs that they would do with them on a strap or whatever would mean a lot of war, peace, whatever. He brought 4,000 of them as a token to the chief. They wouldn't let him in to the village until he went back and strung them off, because he just had them in a bag. So here's a very aristocratic person sitting at a campfire stringing beads just so he could get into the village. So that's very important. One other thing is money. Money was scarce on the frontier. Each colony had its own money. Each colony's money was worth X amount. If you had Pennsylvania token script and you tried to cash it in Virginia, you might lose 30 cents on the dollar. So a lot of times they had to, that was important. I have a few original pieces here if you want to look at it. One of the, you always heard of the piece 8. It was very popular because of the silver. If you went to the trading post and you happened to have a piece of 8 and the powder you wanted to buy was 50 cents and all you had was $1, they cut it in half. And that's why they call it a piece of 8. But they also would have scales to weigh it, because a lot of people would try to shave a little bit more so they would weigh. Huh? No, this is French. No, let's see, it's Spanish, isn't it? Which is it? Yeah, it's French. They still use pound and sterling. So they used pounds, sterlings, and pence. And then after the revolution, at the start of the revolution, they started doing it too. Here's some examples of that. Okay, our time's about up. I hope I haven't bored you too much. If you'd like to come up and look, ask any more questions, feel free. I thank you. Which one? Oh, I would like to thank our illustrious guide at the Capitol, Ms. Grace, for her benefit.
Sorry, I want for you to tell a little bit about the outfit you have when you did
Okay, clothing. Depending on which location you're at. If you're back on the tidewater and you're in town, you dressed in your best. If you were without a waistcoat, which that's what this is, waistcoat, waistcoat, sleeveless, if you didn't have that on, they basically called you undressed. Now, you should have a coat on top of this, but on the frontier, most of them just wore a shirt. They didn't have it. If they had it, they had it. The trousers, most everybody thinks of the colonial period, everybody wore knee breeches and buckled shoes. That's true. A lot of people did. Out west, out across the mountains, they found the trousers were being more comfortable. Plus, they didn't have to wear stockings. They didn't have to wear leggings, Indian leggings. And some of them did anyway. But it's just like today, everybody dresses different. You had a typical shirt. The French and Indian War period, like this, and long, closer to the Revolution, things came up. The shirts come shorter. And I'll tell you what, the best person to talk to about clothing is right behind you, Gracie. Because her documentation is tremendous. I've seen her books. And she works here at the Kato. She'll give you a grand tour, depending on the mood she's in. But anyway, a neck scarf, cravat, whatever. It's like the cowboys and Indians. You never saw a cowboy without a neck scarf, because you can do everything with it. This is supposed to be documented by a well-known authority documentation. So I don't know. It's not Gracie on this one. I won't blame him on this. Hat can be anything from a scarf to a round hat, which is a short brimmed hat about 3 inches with 4 inches tall, to a flop hat, which is about 6 inches wide. We call them slouch hats. To a tricorn. Tricorns, 2 different types, civilian and military. Military were higher on this. They had them up so that when they fired a musket, the smoke wouldn't blind it. It was a style. This is made out of rabbit fur. A lot of them were made out of buffalo hair, buffalo wool. There's been quite a bit of discussion on Frontier Folks, which is a website that really goes into a lot of this. Coon hats, raccoon hats. And they were raccoon fur. And it's matted just like your felt hat. It's just a felt hat. This was a style. Anything else?
Just wanted you to comment.
Now, my shoes, which I can't get up, they're moccasins. They're referred to today as Ligonier moccasins because they found an example in an excavation at Fort Ligonier, Pennsylvania. Where it's right or not, all I can go by what I read. They had center seam moccasins, which these are pucker toe. These are center seam. And I think Doug can, depending on which tribe someone's been around, depending on which type of moccasin they might be wearing. There was pucker toes, moccasins like this, and shoes, hard shoes, would eventually wear out, and they would go with this because it was easier to fix and repair. Okay, is there any other questions? Okay, I'm done.